Welcome to the fifth video in our series, Understanding Inflation and Escalation in Defense Acquisition, a guide for better public understanding. Today, we will present an overview on how the Department of Defense utilizes the different cost figures produced by escalation and inflation in decision-making. Let's begin. So how are the different cost figures used in decision-making in the Department of Defense? To start, let's have a quick recap on our last few videos. We now understand why there can be multiple figures for a DoD cost estimate. For the Columbia-class program, the $128 billion estimate represents a realistic cost estimate based upon projected escalation rates, and it represents the actual amount of money expected to leave the Treasury for the program over its acquisition period. The $100 billion estimate has been derived from the same $128 billion estimate but has been adjusted for inflation over the program's acquisition period. The $28 billion difference reflects the change in the purchasing power of the dollar over the program's acquisition period. Now that we understand how both figures are derived, how would the government use the $128 billion figure? Well, if the government only budgeted $100 billion to leave the Treasury to pay for the Columbia-class program, then they would have neglected the effects of inflation, which are inherent in escalation, and risk significantly underfunding the program. So how are these figures used? Let's recall the quote from the Breaking Defense article we introduced in Video 1. Replacing aging Ohio-class nuclear missile submarines could cost so much it busts the Navy's budget. But how much? That gets complicated. The media's been saying $128 billion. The Navy would prefer we say $100 billion. Both figures are right. If the $128 billion estimate is what the government must budget for, then why would the Navy prefer to quote the $100 billion estimate? Well, there are two primary reasons. First, the Navy may prefer to state the $100 billion estimate because, like many defense programs, the Columbia-class program is executed over a long time frame, and it experiences significant price effects due to inflation. As you may recall, any price changes due to inflation are entirely outside of the Navy's control. But then you may ask, why doesn't the Navy prefer to use a different cost figure altogether that removes the effects of both inflation and real price change, both of which are also outside of the Navy's control? Well, that brings us to our second reason. The Navy may prefer to use the $100 billion estimate because it is adjusted for inflation. Adjusting an estimate for inflation preserves the effect of real price change, which can be different between programs and can be very important for making accurate comparisons. A real-world example of how inflation-adjusted estimates are used is called an analysis of alternatives, or an AOA. The goal of an AOA is to accurately compare the cost estimates of multiple programs. For example, let's suppose the DoD is analyzing two potential programs to perform strategic retaliation, a submarine platform and an aircraft platform. Because both programs serve a similar mission, they can be considered as viable alternatives to one another. However, because one program is a submarine and one is an aircraft, it is likely that the acquisition periods for each program are different and are affected by escalation and price changes in very different ways. If each program was producing exactly 10 units, one cannot just transfer $1 from year 4 in the submarine program to year 6 in the aircraft program because the purchasing power of the dollar in year 4 of a program is not equal to the purchasing power of the dollar in year 6 of another program. It is likely that the acquisition periods for each program are different and are affected by escalation and price changes in many different ways. Therefore, one must adjust for inflation to understand which alternative is the most cost-effective. After removing distortions such as inflation, programs can be viewed in terms of comparable inflation-adjusted figures. Now that we've adjusted for inflation, notice that the submarine program now costs less than the alternative aircraft program. One may wonder why estimates are not adjusted for escalation. This is because controlling for escalation would remove the effects of inflation and real price change. Unlike inflation, one cannot remove the same escalation rate from different programs because different programs have unique escalation rates. Comparing dollars converted from different rates is like comparing different currencies. Inflation provides a common method for converting dollars across programs, but without removing the real price change information that can vary across programs. This is why inflation is so important in decision making. If we try to compare programs without adjusting for inflation, then it would be like hosting a fight night between opponents of different weight classes. You can't have two programs unfairly compete with their realistic estimates. You first need to put them on the same level, or in the same weight class, by adjusting for inflation first. Hopefully by now you've gathered a good understanding of the ways escalation and inflation are used in the defense acquisition process. Let's wrap things up. In conclusion, the realistic cost estimate, or the $128 billion figure for the Columbia-class program, is derived from realistic escalation rates. It is a realistic cost estimate. It maintains the effects of inflation and real price change. The estimate cannot be used for cross-program comparison, and the estimate represents the actual amount of dollars the government expects to spend on a program. The adjusted cost estimate, or the $100 billion figure for the Columbia-class program, is derived from the realistic cost estimate, or in this case, the $128 billion estimate. This estimate is the inflation-adjusted cost estimate. It also maintains the effects of real price change, but not inflation. It can be used for cross-program comparisons, and it does not represent the actual amount of dollars the government expects to spend on a program. Please take some time to analyze the differences between the estimates side by side. Thank you for watching. This concludes the 5th video in our series, Understanding Inflation and Escalation in Defense Acquisition, a guide for better public understanding. For more information or additional resources on how inflation and escalation are used in defense acquisition, please visit our website at cade.osd.mil/policy/inflation.